In the pocket, that's the best place. Usually, yes.
Folks, if everyone will take a seat, if you're waiting for coffee, please just wait quietly in line. We've got a great crew out here today. We're thrilled to see so many folks. Let's take advantage of every open seat. And at this time, it's my privilege to invite Jane Cogden, Greenwich's funniest person, who is a friend of Dr. Robert Waldinger, as she will make the introduction. We may have time for a few quick questions towards the end, and we do have to quit right around noon, so let's make the most use of our time. I'm going to turn it over to Jane. And Jane, thank you for helping to bring Dr. Waldinger to be with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Reverend Merrick. So some of you know me. My name is Jane Condon, if you like me. If you don't like me, my name is Bob Waldinger. And he and my husband Ken Bartels were college classmates. And in the years after they graduated, Bob married the psychologist Jennifer Stone over there, and Ken married me. And those were the first steps in their very successful careers, I think. Yeah, right. I'll take the applause. Let's give it up. Okay. Bob is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He's also a Zen priest, which we love and adore about him. More importantly for today's talk, he is the director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which tracked 724 families over the course of more than 80 years. It's the longest longitudinal study ever done. He and his team studied what makes a happy life, a long life, a satisfied life, in short, a good life. And it was back in 2015, we heard he was going to give a little TED Talk, and we thought, oh, good, happy for Bob. And then when we finally watched it, it was up to 20 million views. And then when I saw it again a few months ago, and it was at 44 million views, and yesterday it was at 46 million views. It is one of the top TED Talks of all time. Give him a round of applause. And that TED Talk, he expanded into his book, The Good Life, which I want to say makes an incredible Christmas present. You only have 7 left at your bookstore. This is a total pitch, please. She's getting 10 more. She has book plates, so it'll be like Bob signed it. And I want to thank my friend Bobby Eggers for organizing this event. And now I give you our friend, Bob Waldinger.
I don't need it. I got this. Jane is always a really hard act to follow, so I'm just going to do my best. Thank you all for being here, especially after you've already been at the service. So I'm going to cover a small topic today, what makes a good life. And actually, I'm a researcher, and this was never considered a legitimate topic of serious research. Okay, how do I... All right, is this... Yeah. Yeah.
Seems like we're not getting enough audience. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Sorry.
All right, is this... Yeah. This is better. Okay. Well, I said all the important things before, but so what I was saying was that I'm a researcher, and up until about 30 years ago, no serious researcher would ever have studied something as amorphous as what makes a good life. It simply wasn't considered a legitimate area of investigation. And the assumption was that if we were getting wealthier as societies, we were getting happier. And that in fact, as gross domestic product increased, we were thriving. And then somebody decided to actually look at this, and what they found was that in developed societies all over the world, as GDP increased, our levels of happiness were either flatlining or they were going down. And so people began to say, what's happening here? What is the difference between what we think of as happiness, as a good life, and economic wealth? So now, you may know this, the United Nations publishes every year a World Happiness Report. You can download it. Every year they send sociologists, psychologists, demographers all over the world and ask people, what do you need to feel that you're having a good life? And what's interesting is that the results are remarkably consistent all over the world, all age groups, all demographics. And that people do say that they need their basic material needs met, which is no surprise. That, you know, if you don't have food security, if you don't have a roof over your head, of course you're not going to feel like life is good. And they've actually studied this, and they've asked the question, how much money do you need to make to increase your happiness? And up until in the US, you make about $75,000 a year on average, household income. Happiness keeps going up. But then after that, we don't get much increase in happiness at all as our income goes up. So you could make $75 million a year, and it doesn't really make you substantially happier than when you've reached that level of having your basic needs met. So then the question is, well, what does make a good life, and what do people all over the world say they need to feel that life is good? And these things won't surprise you. They feel they need social support. They feel that they need to be able to expect that they're going to have a healthy life, and that means access to decent health care. They need freedom to make the big life choices. And as we know, that varies a lot depending on where we live in the world. One of the most interesting things that people name consistently is they need opportunities to be generous in order to feel like they're having a good life. Not just generous with money, but generous with time, with expertise, with effort. And then finally, people say they need to trust. They need to be able to trust not just their neighbors, but their governments. And we know how much that varies, depending on where we live and what time we're living in. All right. So, if this is what people say consistently, year after year, what is it that young people say they're going to prioritize when they set out on the adult life that they're projecting for themselves? What are your priorities? And so they did a study of this in 2017, thousands of 20-somethings. And they asked them, what are your primary goals? And over 80% of millennials said that their major goal was wealth. It was to get rich, not just to get their basic needs met. Over half of millennials told us 5 years ago that a big priority for them was to become famous. And if you think about it, fame is a very, very strange goal. Having lots of people know your name and really not know you at all. And then finally, over half of those millennials said they needed to prioritize working really hard, lots of achievement at work. So then the question is, what's responsible for the disconnect? These are not the things. Wealth, fame, high achievement are not the things that people tell us in the World Happiness Surveys that they need to have a good life. So where is this disconnect coming from? And clearly, much of it comes from the cultural haze that all of us live in all day long. So that we are getting messages constantly, for everywhere we turn, from media, from billboards, about what the good life is supposed to be, rather than defining it for ourselves. And of course, those of you who are in a spiritual community like this one, turn to other ways to define what's important in life. But most of us are getting these messages that, you know, if you buy this brand of car, you're going to be blissfully happy. You know, if you serve this kind of pasta, your family dinners are going to be joyous, right? If you use this face cream, you will never look old. And And we smile, we laugh about this, but if you think about it, these subliminal messages are hitting us all day long. The other thing that's happened with the digital revolution is social media. So I pulled this from Facebook. It's one of those many, many photos that we post for each other. And if you think about it, if you were coming from outer space and you wanted to learn about human life, and your source of information was social media, you would think we were always at parties, we were always on beautiful beaches, we were always going to dig into great plates of food. So here I come back to what one of my Zen teachers told me a while ago, which seems so important, that it leaves us always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. I'm always comparing the me who wakes up, some days feeling pretty good about life, and some days feeling like I'm lost or sad, with those curated lives that we present to each other, with all of the difficult things cleaned up and washed out, right? The other thing that we get are messages about what we are supposed to look like, what our bodies are supposed to look like. So this is an underwear ad. We see them all the time, and I deliberately chose a man's body, not a woman's body, because women's bodies are much, much more often exploited than men's, right? We are shown this constantly. This is who we're supposed to be. When was the last time the ad agency showed us this kind of ad, right? And actually, I've had sometimes when I use this picture, people say, "Well, that's actually not bad," that one. And we all realize when we name it, when we put it out there, how absurd this is. But these are the messages we're given over and over again. All right. So this is all a lead-in to why I've spent decades of my adult life doing the work that I do, which is studying what life is really like for lots of people as they go through time. So most research about human life is done by asking people to remember the past. 95% of research is retrospective. And that's a perfectly legitimate way to collect information about life, but as you know, our memories are full of holes, and our memories are actually creative. So, just think about what you had for dinner a year ago today. Unless it was a special day, you have no idea, right? There's so much that comes in and then leaves our memory banks as it needs to. But what that means is that a great deal of what happens to us either gets forgotten or gets altered. The very act of calling up a memory alters it, which drives jurists crazy when we think about eyewitness data. But this is an argument for what I do, which is to follow people forward. And of course, I don't just do it. My predecessors did it in this 85-year study, so that we actually don't just ask people to remember the past, but we go back to them again and again and ask them, how's your life right now? And we record that. So one of the other things that we frequently do in my kind of research is we do snapshots. So let's say I wanted to look at the course of depression across the human life cycle. I could take a sample right now of 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds, and I could assume that I know what depression looks like across the life cycle by taking those snapshots and just putting them together. But it turns out we can be led astray by that approach to understanding human life. The best way I can explain this is from a senator from the state of Florida. Some of you remember the name Claude Pepper. He was a senator from Florida, and he once quipped, he said, "When I look at South Florida, I would have to believe you are born Cuban and you die Jewish." Because if you just take snapshots of South Florida, that's what you get. So as you can you can see you can really go astray in understanding what happens through the course of a life cycle by simply doing the snapshot approach. Again, this is telling you why we spend time and millions of taxpayer dollars doing what we do. All right, the Harvard study of adult development is, as far as we know, the longest study of the same people going through their lives that has ever been done. Probably will never be replicated. It began actually as two studies that didn't know about each other. Both were started on the Harvard University campus. One was started at the Harvard Student Health Service, and it was started with a group of sophomores, 19-year-olds, who were thought by their deans to be fine, upstanding young men. So they wanted to study normal development of the transition from adolescence to young adulthood. So, of course, if you want to study normal development, you study all white guys from Harvard, right? I mean, this is, we are constantly having to explain to NIH why they should still fund us. And the other study was started at Harvard Law School. And it was a study of juvenile delinquency, started by Sheldon Gluck, a law professor, and Eleanor Gluck, a social worker. They were husband and wife. And they were interested in the question of how some children born into really disadvantaged circumstances managed to stay on good developmental paths. And so they selected children from not just the poorest families in Boston in 1938, but families known on average to 5 social service agencies for domestic violence, for severe parental mental illness, physical illness. And their question was, how do these children stay on good developmental paths? Now, eventually we brought in spouses, and eventually we brought in children, more than half of whom are females, so we do have gender balance. And many of the wives who had been serving our interviewers tea and cookies for years finally said, you know, it's about time you started studying the women. What we do not have are any people of color. That's probably the major limitation of this study. The city of Boston in 1938 was 97.4% white. So if you want to study people in 1938 in Boston, you study white people. Since then, we have collaborated with and keep track of other studies of more diverse groups. So the findings that I'm going to present to you today have been corroborated in more diverse groups. And if they haven't, I will mention that. All right. So when the study began in 1938, researchers went to people's families' homes. So we didn't just study the Harvard sophomores and the inner city boys. We went to their homes. We sat down with their parents, with their grandparents, long ancestral histories about child rearing styles, notes about what was being served for dinner and what the curtains looked like on the windows. Just so many rich data on these families. And then the Harvard men were of an age to be eligible for World War II, so almost all served in World War II. The inner city men were on average 9 years younger, so they did not go to the war. And then they all came back and went into all walks of life: doctors, factory workers, lawyers, some famous people. John F. Kennedy was part of the Harvard group. Bill Bradley, longtime editor of the Washington Post, was also part of the Harvard group. Part of the inner city delinquent group was the Boston Strangler. But most people in this study, 724 families, were not famous, they weren't infamous, they were just living their lives. And they would ask us, why do you keep wanting to study me? Because we would go back to them again and again. And then gradually, we began to study aging and retirement as our first generation got older. And now the second generation, they're all baby boomers. Almost all the first generation have passed away. Of the 724, about 30 are still alive. They're all in their late 90s and early 100s, and we're still in touch with them. And we're very much in touch with their children, and we're collecting data even as we speak on the children. So what's been studied? It's really the big domains of human life that we study: mental health, physical health. For the Harvard men, World War II experiences, work experiences, how satisfied people were in their jobs, who got promoted, who got fired, how much money they made every year. Relationships, which we've done a lot of work on, and then, as I said, aging and retirement. We are sort of a history of science project in that we've started out in 1938 asking people to fill out questionnaires. We've done interviews, we've done medical exams, but then as new ways of studying human life came on board, we adopted them to study the same big subjects. So now we draw blood for DNA and messenger RNA. That wasn't even conceived of in 1938. We put people into the MRI scanner and we watch how their brains light up in different ways when we show them different kinds of images. We bring them into our laboratory, we deliberately stress them out, and then we watch how they calm down. These are all different ways of getting windows on human thriving, on the experience of well-being. Okay, so what did we learn? Well, one of the things we learned, which will not be a surprise to any of you, is that if we take care of our health, it matters enormously for not just how long we live, but how long we stay healthy. But the finding that began to emerge about 30 years ago that we at first didn't believe was that, in fact, the people who stayed the healthiest and lived the longest were the people who were most connected to other people. That the people who literally saw more people in a given day, in a given week, lived longer, stayed healthier, and in particular, people who had warmer relationships with others had this benefit. And at first, we didn't believe it because, you know, it makes sense. If you have happier relationships, okay, you're going to be happier. That would not be a surprise. But how could having more relationships and warmer relationships predict that you'd be less likely to get coronary artery disease or type 2 diabetes or arthritis? Like, how could that possibly be? And then many other research groups began to find the same thing, and we began to understand that this was a robust, replicable finding, and we began to study the mechanisms. And so for about the last 10 years, our lab and many other labs have been working on this problem of how do relationships get into our bodies and shape our health. So we know that loneliness, which is the opposite of social connection, is a predictor of the breakdown of health. So some researchers have calculated that loneliness is as strong a risk factor for poor health as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day, as having untreated high blood pressure, as being obese. The other thing is that intimacy keeps us alive. In many studies all over the world, being in an intimate relationship confers a longevity benefit. So men live 7 to 17 years longer, women live 5 to 12 years longer. In all these marital studies, it's always a better deal for men than for women, but women do get a benefit here. And it's obviously not just the marriage license that's at play here. It is this experience of living with another person in a close relationship, and I could say more about that. The other thing we find is that it's not just bodily health that's protected, it's brain health. That people who have broader social networks as they get older and are more engaged socially have slower cognitive decline, and many are less likely to get cognitive decline. And so what we find is that, and there's more and more evidence coming out about this, that one of the best things we can do for our brains as we get older is to stay engaged in the world and engaged with other people. Okay. Now, loneliness, as you probably have heard, is considered epidemic now throughout the world, particularly the developed world, and very much in the United States. So our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has taken this on as a pillar of his current platform. You know, most Surgeon Generals work on smoking or obesity. He has pointed out rightly that loneliness is a terrible threat to public health. So loneliness is that subjective experience of being less connected to others than you want to be. And that means that, you know, you can be lonely in a crowd. Many people are lonely in a marriage. Or you can be perfectly content and not lonely all by yourself on a mountaintop. So loneliness is subjective. So just in 2023, when the Gallup organization surveyed Americans, 17% of adults, when they were asked, said, yes, I was lonely a lot of the day yesterday. That's 44 million people in the United States. And this is probably an underestimation. These rates are similar all over the developed world, and they're increasing in places like India and now China. The loneliest groups, what was a surprise to me was that young adults, aged 16 to 24, are the loneliest age group in the United States. I imagine these are all people, you know, around other young people, living their best lives, but it turns out that it is a time filled with anxiety and disconnection. And also low-income households. So economic disadvantage is connected to loneliness and disconnection. So how does this work? As I said, we're looking for mechanisms. Probably the best theory for how loneliness breaks down our health and how connection protects our health has to do with stress. That what we believe is that relationships are essentially stress regulators. If I have something upsetting happen to me today, you know, I can go home and complain to Jennifer about it, and I can literally feel my body calm down. You know, if you have someone you can call, someone you can talk to, the physiology changes when you're able to connect with another person around stressful emotions. And this is well documented. Our immune systems work less well when we are stressed and when we are lonely, so we're more susceptible to illness. Our bodies heal less well. We heal less well from surgeries when we're lonely and disconnected. Chronic inflammation is a common feature of people who are lonely and more isolated than they want to be. Okay, now one of the fun things about following people over 85 years is you get to ask the same questions again and again. So we ask the same questions about marriage. We ask 6 questions 8 times over 50 years. The questions, you know, how satisfied are you? How often do you argue? And what we found, and other studies have found this as well, is that we're happiest with our partners when we first get together. And then if couples have children, marital satisfaction goes down when the first child is born. And then it goes up again when the last child leaves home. And then this is a robust finding in many studies. And then what they're beginning to find because of changing demographics is that marital satisfaction only goes down again if kids come back to live at home. This is true. Now again, these are averages. Some of you will have children living at home and you're all really happy. These are averages over thousands of families. All right. The other thing is that you could think from what I'm saying that relationships have to be happy and smooth all the time for you to get these benefits, and that is simply not true. So no relationship of any consequence is without conflict, without difficulty. And in fact, we tested this. We invited couples into our lab and we asked them to have an argument with each other about the things they normally argue about. It might have been, you know, housework or time alone or taking care of the kids, anything they normally argue about. And we would set up these arguments, we'd set up the video cameras, and these couples would just, they knew they were being videotaped, but they were just off to the races, having these really intense arguments. And then we had people watch the tapes afterwards and rate them for what emotions were expressed, how often. And what we found was it wasn't the amount of anger in the couple's argument that predicted who would stay together 5 years later and who would be happy. It was whether our raters could see affection and respect even while the couple was having an argument. If they were expressing affection and respect even while they were mad at each other, it predicted that they would stay together and they would be happier. Which I think it's really important to call out, because otherwise we can imagine that, well, my relationships aren't smooth all the time. Nobody's relationships are. All right, the other thing as we follow people over time is we learn that we get happier as we get older. And this is a surprising finding. It began with a group at Stanford studying this. And what we've learned is that we as a human species get happier as we age. And the question is why? And there's an investigator named Laura Carstensen who has found that, in fact, the awareness of our own mortality gets greater when we get into about our mid-40s, and then it keeps going and it gets greater and greater, rather than making us more depressed, which I would have thought. It actually makes us do certain things that make us happier. So well-being starts to become a priority. We pay more attention to what's positive. As younger people, our brains are biased to pay more attention to what's negative. And that's actually got good survival value. But we way overemphasize what's wrong. If you think about it, if you get one tiny piece of negative feedback and you get lots of positive feedback, it's the negative that you dwell on, right? And so our brains are wired that way. But then as we get older, our brains shift to emphasizing and paying more attention to the positive. We remember our past more positively. There's a bumper sticker that says, "It's never too late to have a happy childhood." We revise our memories to be more in a more positive direction as we get older. We get choosier about how we spend our time. So in fact, it turns out systematically we stop going to those meetings that we hate. We stopped seeing those friends who we haven't really enjoyed for a very long time. So you see this mild trimming of social networks as people age, and what that does is it tends to make them spend more time with the people and in the activities that they truly care about. And we spend more time smelling the roses, savoring the present moment as we get older. And all of this gets us to be happier. Now, the other thing we study is how we spend our money, how we spend our discretionary income. And actually, this work comes from another laboratory. They asked the question, when you have extra money to spend, does it make you happier to spend it on material things, or does it make you happier to spend it on experiences? So material things, it could be, a new piece of clothing, or it could be a piece of jewelry, or a flat screen TV. Experiences could be tickets to a concert, or a football game, or a family vacation. And as you can guess, the best things in life turn out not to be things. That paying for experiences makes us happier and keeps us happier longer than paying for material things. And so as researchers, we ask, well, how does that work? Why does that work that way? Well, it turns out that material things just beg for comparison, right? We compare, if I buy a nice new flat screen TV and I take it home and I'm excited about it, then I go to somebody else's house and they've got a bigger TV. We're just wired to compare. And what happens is that experiences don't lend themselves to that kind of comparison. My trip to the museum with my family isn't quite like yours, right? My family vacation isn't quite like yours. And so that comparison element that, as Teddy Roosevelt said, is the thief of joy, doesn't play as much of a role. The other thing is that when we do pay for experiences, usually we're either with people we already know, we go with family or friends, or we meet new people, or both. This was a family vacation we took, and these were people in my boat, And, so what we find is that paying for experiences is more likely to deepen current connections and make new connections. All right. The other thing we know is that we're kind of bad at predicting what will make us happy. So I'm just going to give you one brief example of that. That it turns out that making connections with people we don't know makes us much happier than we expect it will. So there was a study in the city of Chicago. Chicago, as you know, has this train system, and there are a lot of commuters on the elevated railways and other trains around Chicago. So the researchers chose two groups at random, assigned one group of commuters to do what they normally do during their commute, to be on their phone, to listen to music, read the newspaper, and the other group to a stranger. And they asked people in advance, how much do you think you're going to like doing this assignment we've given you? And the people who were assigned to talk to a stranger thought they were not going to like it. The people thought they would be much happier just staying to themselves. But when they asked if they had completed their assignment, the people who spoke to strangers were much, much happier than the people who had just kept to themselves. Find this reliably. So what it means is that you probably notice within yourself there's a little resistance to talking to a new person in the checkout line at the supermarket, or in the Uber as you're and that what we find is that these casual encounters actually give us little hits of well-being that contribute to these benefits that research describes. Okay, now I'm going to go quickly. Robert Putnam is a political scientist who wrote a book called Bowling. He surveyed how much we invest in what he calls social capital, invest in each other, in our communities. And what he found was that starting in the 1950s, when television was introduced to the American home, we stopped going out. We stopped going to houses of worship. We stopped inviting people over to our homes. We stopped having family dinners. And then Putnam went back 25 years ago and asked again in the early 2000s and found that all of these trends had gotten much worse. Attending clubs had dropped by almost 60%. Family 43%, and we know family dinners are enormously impactful for child development and family cohesion. Having friends over in the last 25 years has gone down by 35%. And when they ask people, do you have anybody you can talk to about personal matters? 1 in 4 people said that they could talk to. All right, so is that the digital revolution accelerated in these trends. They began much earlier. But the computer age has really gotten us addicted to these wonderful screens. They've taken us away from the natural world. This is... I think it was in the New York Times. It's one of those classic photos, right? And you see people, you see people in beautiful settings that just lost in their phone. The Gallup organization had a poll of 15 million workers, and they asked the question, do you have a best friend at work? And what they meant, is there anybody at work that you can talk to about personal matters? The people who had a best friend at work were better with customers. They produced higher quality work. They were less likely to get injured on the job. All those good things. Only 30% of those 15 million workers had a friend at work. And when they surveyed the 70% who did not have a friend at work, only 1 in 12 they were engaged in their jobs. And 11 out of 12 said they were sort of checked out of their work lives. This is really important because leaders in organizations often have the idea that socializing at work is a distraction and will reduce productivity. It turns out it has the opposite effect. Studies find this, good research out of business schools. Half of CEOs report that they feel lonely much or all of their day. So it's a problem at all levels. So then how do we lean into relationships? Well, here I'm going to turn to one of my then teachers, John Tarrant, who said something I come back to constantly. Attention of love. Giving our undivided attention to each other is undoubtedly the most valuable thing we have to give each other. It's also one of the most difficult things now when you think of all that's pulling us away from each other attentionally. And so that as a North Star is what inspires many programs now to try to help people reconnect with each other, both on a small scale with the people we love, but also on a larger communal. There's a lot of ways to do it. Date nights to liven up relationships, work settings can be structured, encourage more collaboration and relationship with families so that families are less stressed and have more time to eat. And community involvement, like the kind of community involvement you're all experiencing right here now. We took some of the findings of our research and put it into a program that we're using. We call it Roadmaps for Life Transitions. And it's just a 5-session program where people come and talk about their lives with each other and sort of reconnect with, where am I right now in my life, and what are the values that are most important to me, and how can I express those values in different areas of my life? How can I increase the health of my relationships? What does that even look like? How do I meet the big life challenges that keep coming my way? So these are some of the subjects that we cover. And this is just one of many programs that are being developed to try to help us counter these trends that we are all seeing. So bottom line is human connection is this major source, not just of happiness, but of health, that improving our relationships is something that we can actually teach. They are skills. We can teach them to children, and there have been terrific results teaching social and emotional skills to kids, and we can teach them to adults. And what we're learning is that this trend toward increasing disconnection is the path of least resistance, and that we need to be more proactive as a society if we are going to counter these trends and stay more connected to each other and protect our health. So that's the end of my formal remarks. And
Bob, do you have time for a few questions?
we do have time for a few questions.
So I'll mention two things. One is this is all on live stream right now, so there's been so much we've had to listen to that has just stimulated us, and you'll probably want to go back and follow it. So you can go on live stream and watch the whole thing over and over again. You can also send that to friends and family who you think would be blessed to hear that. So if you have a question at this time, please just make it a brief, clear question. And also, Dr. Waldinger's book is available at the bookstore right after. And finally, just a word of great thanks to Bobby Eggers and Jane Cogden, who made this all possible. Thank you so much for your work with this. Thank you. We have a question over here, brief question.
Hi, Dr. Waldinger. Thank you for being here and speaking with us. Does your study include, because you mentioned the messenger DNA and so on, did you study hormones like cortisol and stuff like that impact on mental health?
We did study cortisol. That's great that you asked that question. So cortisol is like the classic stress hormone, so you don't want to, it's a normal hormone in our bodies, but you don't want to have elevated levels because it breaks down our body systems. And so what we did was it turns out there's a new discovery in the last 10 years that you deposit cortisone in your hair as it grows. And so if you want to study how chronically stressed we are, whether you have chronically elevated levels of this stress hormone, cortisol, you can take a little sample of hair and analyze it. And so we've done that. And so we have the data now, and we're going to be analyzing this as a way to look at who is chronically stressed.
How about faith communities? Can you just share a word about the impact they play?
Faith communities?
Yes.
So it's interesting. In our study, we asked the question, do you have a religious or spiritual practice? About half and half, yes, no. And we didn't find different levels of happiness between those two groups, but what we found was that many people found great comfort in dealing with the trials of life when they had a religious community, a spiritual practice. The other thing is that there's other data. So our study says we didn't find a difference, but we're just one study. So there's a study called the Human Flourishing Project. You can Google it. And it's one of my colleagues at Harvard runs it. They are finding more results that suggest considerable benefit to communities of faith in promoting well-being. So you don't want to just listen to any one study, including mine. You want to see multiple studies and whether they point in the same direction.
Thank you.
Hi, you mentioned a statistic about young adults and loneliness. Was that statistic derived before COVID? And if not, has there been more studies after COVID with loneliness among young adults?
Yes and yes. So some of the results are from before COVID, and so for example, the UK was doing good surveys right before COVID. Loneliness got worse, but now it has stayed high. Levels of loneliness have stayed high. I'm more familiar with the US and the UK than other places. But in other words, what we thought was that a lot of the loneliness was going to subside. It hasn't so much. And there have been higher levels of depression and anxiety, particularly among young adults. And those don't seem to be subsiding so much either. And there does seem to be a real clear connection with social media use for young people.
I have a question. Have you studied any people who have or have not, don't have pets? People with pets?
Yeah. So we didn't. I wish we had. You know, you have so many questions you wish you asked when you do this kind of long study. We had people who would report on their pets and report how vital they were to their well-being, but we never systematically asked. There are more studies now being done about this. And so I think we're going to learn more, you know, in the near future, because so many people are finding pets to be enormous sources of comfort and joy. So, yeah.
Yes, we know that dog lovers are happiest, but on to the next question.
Could you address, I know the study doesn't cover DNA, but I've read that a lot of people believe, or scientists believe, that a lot of our attitudes are baked in when we come out of the womb. So could you address that?
Yes. One of my genetics professors in med school said, every parent is a strict environmentalist until they have their second child. Because the kids just are born different, right? So there's actually been a good study of this. There's a psychologist named Sonia Lubomirsky who did a lot of study to estimate how much of our happiness, how much of mood is determined by genetics. And she estimates that it's about 50%. And then, and that, because, you know, we all know Eeyores who are kind of gloomy all the time, and we all know Tiggers who are happy almost no matter what, right? And some of that seems to be genetic, seems to be temperamental. And then, so she estimated 50% genetic, about 10% our current life circumstances, which is surprising, because we would think, well, our current life circumstances must make all the difference. Turns out not so much. And she estimates that 40% of our well-being is malleable, meaning it's under our control, which can sound like a little or a lot, depending on how you hear it, right? But what it does say is that we can make a difference in our own well-being by the kinds of things that we do and the ways that we set up our lives. But we can't do everything, right? That there's some of it we're born with.
Can you tell us, as a generalization, how important are gender differences? in the summary measures that you've discussed.
Yes, yes. So there are, gender differences are more important, obviously, in some areas than others. We assumed, because the culture sort of tells us that women are better at relationships, relationships are much more important to women than men. And when we wrote the book, we went back and reviewed the literature. And it turns out the gender differences aren't that great, that relationships are almost as important to men as they are to women, but the activities that go on in male relationships and female relationships are somewhat different. Women are much more likely to confide in each other. Men are much more likely to do activities together. But that doesn't mean that men are less connected or want to be less connected. I'm really glad you asked the question.
Here we go, right here.
Yeah.
Hi, and good morning, Dr. Waldinger. You mentioned you collect some of the DNA and mRNA from the people, and it's a very good cohort study. So have you ever published, or did you get some results or conclusion from the mRNA, DNA relationships with these behaviors? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I know, it's a great question. We haven't yet published, and you don't work at NIH, do you? NIH is always asking us, when are these results coming out? So we haven't yet published, but what we're finding is that there are certain stress profiles where, and this is, we collaborate with a man named Stephen Cole at UCLA, and there are certain genes that get turned on and certain genes that get turned off when we're stressed. And then when we're in more comfortable circumstances, it's the reverse. And this idea of turning on and off genes has become a really important area of research because it has everything to do with changes in our well-being. There's a really interesting hypothesis that we're more susceptible to bacteria when we're stressed, when we're under stress, because in times of war and conflict, we're more likely to get injured, and we're more susceptible to viruses when we are in close quarters, because when things are cozy, we're more likely to spread viruses with each other. So there are these kinds of hypotheses that are coming out that we're going to start testing with our people, because we can look at their messenger RNA and we can look at their stress levels in different circumstances.
Someone has asked why the male suicide rate is so much higher in the U.S. than the female suicide rate. Has your study looked at that or found anything about that?
You know, we don't study suicide. It's a really important area of study. The thing is that fortunately suicide is rare enough that if you take 724 families, fortunately you're not going to have very many suicides. So we can't study that systematically. You have to have enough people to have enough statistical power to do it. But there's very good research going on now. There's a professor named Matthew Nock, N-O-C-K, at Harvard, that there's a lot of good work out there. So I would encourage people to see what's out there online.
Hi. Again, about the RNA, mRNA, DNA, have you associated that with the polyvagal studies, the polyvagal nerve?
No, but so we did heart rate variability, which is polyvagal theory has to do with, so essentially our parasympathetic nervous systems calm us down. Our sympathetic nervous systems rev us up for the fight or flight response. And then how well do we calm down has a lot to do with this nervous system that's not in our conscious control unless we practice it. So we've studied heart rate variability and we are doing some work on that. We haven't published the data from it yet. It's really complicated data.
Well, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you. Yeah. This has been outstanding. Really, really great. You have taught us so much today. We've learned a lot. We hope to build on this. Thank you all for coming out. Have a great day. God bless you.